been out here with these first responders, and they see me as one of their own.
Eric Adams marched at last week's parade for essential workers. He said those workers saw him as one of their own. That observation may have been at the core of his campaign. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. It was a long, tumultuous campaign. Thanks to a Board of Elections snafu, it ended with some chaos. Adams' substantial lead after the first round of vote counting dipped to less than 1% in the final tally, but a win is a win. The Times described the primary race as, quote, one of the most critical elections in a generation, with the winner expected to help set New York on a recovery course from the economic devastation of a COVID-19 and from the longstanding racial and socioeconomic inequalities that the pandemic deepened. Adams, a former cop, promised to be tough on New York's surging violent crime, but also to push for racial justice. Was crime the decisive issue in the campaign? And how did Adams, a centrist, almost Biden-like candidate, beat the city's progressive establishment with marquee names like AOC backing Maya Wiley? Let's get some election takeaways from Clyde Haberman, a New York Times contributing writer, and Eleanor Randolph, also a Times contributing writer and the author of The Many Lives of Michael Bloomberg, now out in paperback. Eleanor, you covered this race. You watched it from Citizens Union, where you helped Betsy Gottbaum look at the candidates for election surveys. What surprised you about the outcome?
You know, what I saw is that two centrists seem to be winning as mayor. I mean, Catherine Garcia, I saw her. She's a sort of center Democrat, and Adams and Garcia were right up there at the top, even though most of the sort of activity seemed to be from progressives and the socialists and AOC, and that's sort of what you heard about. Now, they may have had much more of an impact on the city council races, and it's going to be, I mean, there's only one seat at this point that is still really open, but it looks like they're going to be as many as 34 or 35 new faces. A lot of those people will be liberal, progressive, left, and many of them will be people of color and plenty of women, more than the group called 21 and 21 wanted 21 women. I think there'll be several more than that, certainly.
Clyde, was your takeaway the same from the primary election? And if so, why do you think that happened?
Yeah, it is basically the same. I think that it helped Eric Adams, among other things, that he was probably the best known of these three people. The truth is, Catherine Garcia, although she came quite close, isn't all that well known to a lot of people. She's never held elective office, and that's a critical factor. The people who we've elected who did not hold previous elective office tended to be either super rich like Bloomberg or well in the public eye on a near daily basis, as Giuliani was. So that's part of it. And I also think that his got to get tough on rising crime is a winning tactic. It also happens to be where I think many people, if not most people in this city are. People get scared real easily. And even though the level of violent crime is not nearly where it was in the worst of this all 30 years ago, in 1990, when we had 2,262 murders, we're nowhere near that. Nonetheless, we're 50% higher than we were just 2 or 3 years ago. And shootings have doubled from the previous year. And so, yeah, enough's enough. And by the way, most murder victims and most murderers are Black and Latino. Those are the communities that are going to be most affected. And it's not surprising that they want somebody who's going to get tough on crime. We saw it That's one reason. That's one reason that Giuliani got into office.
Can I add?
Eleanor, how would you assess? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say all that is correct. The other thing about Eric Adams that I think people were really interested in, as an ex-cop, he was going to be able to deal with the unions, the police unions, which are so strident and have caused, indigestion and problems for mayors for years. But he was an insider. He knows how this operation works, and he's one tough guy. And I think lots of people felt that was the balance, that the streets would be safer if he got elected, and also the police would be held in control. And you can only hope that is exactly the balance that happens.
What do you think the racial component of that vote was? He was an ex-cop, but also a Black ex-cop, which gave him the added advantage of, being sensitive to racial justice, arguably. So this didn't quite seem like a post-racial election. Nobody said, oh my God, we're electing the second Black mayor of New York. But in a way, with all the victories of Black or Hispanic candidates, that didn't seem to be a great factor in people's voting, did it?
Well, I think to some degree, I'm sorry, just very quickly, I think to some degree it was. If you look at the map, where Garcia did best were in Manhattan, south of roughly 96th Street, and in white parts of Staten Island and Queens and Brooklyn. And so I think there is a racial issue that's still very vital in this city.
Eleanor, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I actually think, since I know a great number, it seems, of white people who voted for Eric Adams and who voted for Alvin Bragg for DA, and who have seen progress in all the, like in the state races where you have Blacks running both houses of the state government, and Tish James. So I know it's true that Manhattan was the exception, but I think we're closer to post-racial because, if you look at Queens voted for him, Brooklyn voted for him. Staten Island had plenty of votes for Eric Adams. And so I don't know, we're going to have to wait and see. I think, I'm presuming he's going to be elected in November. I think he's going to be a fascinating mayor to cover. You just sort of don't know where he's going when he starts out in the morning. That he's got a new earring. He's going to be a gift to journalism.
I think it'll be a lot more fun to cover, that's for sure. One quote, go ahead, Clyde.
No, I was just going to be a snarky. You're setting the bar very low in terms of being fun to cover, that's for sure. And when he wakes up in the morning, let's just hope it's indeed in Brooklyn and not in his apartment in New Jersey.
Good point. One quote in a Time story that really struck me by Ms. Daughtry, a political consultant and the daughter of Herb Daughtry, was that maybe Black and brown people are not as progressive as some people want to say they are, or do we need to redefine progressive? Does that make sense, Eleanor?
Well, I was thinking that, you look at people who vote, mostly it's still true that the majority of the great block of voters are older. And, if you talk to older Blacks and Hispanics in their communities, they're the ones that Clyde was talking about earlier. They're the ones who really care about safe streets. They don't want gangs coming through and shooting their children through the window. They don't want to go to Times Square and hear about a tourist being shot. They are like all of us. They care about a basic level of safety in the city, and they tend to be the ones that vote. We always get a lot of noise from the younger voters. I don't know what happens to them when it comes to going to the polls. They get rerouted somehow.
Clyde, did ranked choice voting work?
I think that the jury's still out on that, Sam. It would have been interesting to see what would have happened if it was simply the old system where you needed 40% of the vote to avoid a runoff. We probably would have had a runoff between Eric Adams and Maya Wiley. So we'll have to see if indeed it works. And first, we have to define what does work mean. To me, it worked in the sense that it gave people a broader sense of choice and not merely my guy or my gal, if you will, and nobody else. So, and again, I'm fascinated by how many people clearly made Catherine Garcia their second choice, maybe third choice. But whether it works or not, it's going to need another plebiscite to undo it if we want to undo it. Voters voted for this a few years ago, so and quite overwhelmingly, I believe. So we're stuck with it, whether it works or not, until voters say no, forget about it.
Eleanor, from what we know of Eric Adams' agenda, and assuming, of course, he gets elected in November, how is this city going to look different under a Mayor Adams than it has under a Mayor de Blasio?
Oh, under de Blasio. Well, I think one of the things he's going to look at is what is called affordable housing. And he has talked, people who've met with him and talked to him, he talks about what is really affordable housing that he wants to build. He wants to support the developers. The real estate community was apparently extremely happy that he got elected. But the sort of ruse about affordable housing means that they're building apartments for people who make $150,000 a year. And that's not affordable to most New Yorkers. I mean, if you try to get in one of these apartments, it's literally impossible if you make $50,000 a year. So that is one of the things I think he's promised that we're going to see that. He's going to keep charter schools. Another way he was sort of middle of the road. I think he's going to be, first of all, the big difference between Adams and de Blasio is that Adams is almost a 24-hour mayor, and we had like a 4-hour mayor with de Blasio, so, or maybe 5. And so I think that will be extremely in our face and different, and I don't know, it's one of the, who knows how this is going to work. The one thing that we do not really know about Adams is what kind of manager he is. I mean, he talks a great line. He talks about, the going to other mayors and talking about management skills and things like that. I don't know how he's going to manage over 50 departments and 300,000 employees. That's going to be a real question.
A lot will depend, of course, on who he appoints, and a lot will depend on how well he gets along with the governor, which is an open question.
Right.
Clyde, let me ask you something you brought up in the past very quickly. What happened to the Republican Party? Not to denigrate Curtis Sliwa, of course, but this is a party that nominated and elected John Lindsay, Rudy Giuliani, Mike Bloomberg. Where is this party today? And isn't this an embarrassment for the party?
I feel you can denigrate Curtis Sliwa all you want. I mean, he's.
You can. You're an opinion writer.
Okay, I will. I will. But I'll repeat what I said the last time we discussed this, Sam. Nothing's changed. It is a brain dead party. It is a brain dead party at the national level. It has no ideas except to oppose. The fact that it has Donald Trump as its leader, and they're all afraid to take him on when they know he's off the charts, is an example of that. And again, the previous Republicans you cited, I throw in Fiorello LaGuardia while we're at it, is just a sign of where that party has disintegrated to. There's not a single Republican office holder that I could think of in this city who would qualify as a clear, deserving, and forthright and going to do a good job and represent the city where the city is politically. I can think of a single one, quite frankly, and because I think that person doesn't exist.
Thanks to Eleanor Randolph, Clyde Haberman of the New York Times. And coming up next, what can the US do about hacks and ransomware originating in Russia? President Biden held a high-stakes summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin on June 16th. Biden warned that hacking and ransomware attacks were a threat to our economy and the US would respond. But just a few weeks later, Russian hackers hit a contractor for the Republican National Committee, and Russian cyber criminals launched a big, aggressive, and technically sophisticated ransomware attack on a US software company that manages technology for hundreds of firms. Pressure is building on Biden to respond forcefully. Sounds tempting, but it's not that simple or without risk. The Times writes, quote, "The very nature of the attacks also makes responding and deterring them difficult, while the ransomware criminals in this case may be operating from Russian territory as they devise their attacks and collect their ransoms in cryptocurrency. The attacks themselves can be launched from computer servers anywhere around the world." Should the US take down the servers of the Russian criminals? Can it? Should we freeze or wipe out the financial holdings of the oligarchs who back Putin? How do we respond without risking a dangerous cyber war with Russia? David Sanger is a White House and national security correspondent for The Times. He's also the author of The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. David, we're talking before the weekend. Obviously, we may get overtaken by events, but what happened to R.Evil and the cyber ransomware hackers? Where did they go?
Well, Sam, thanks for having me back on. So the story of R.Evil is an interesting one because, as you indicated in your introduction, we don't think they work for the Russian government, but we think that they operate from Russia. They certainly write their code in Russian language. And there's reason to believe that Putin and his intelligence services kind of like having them around because they fulfill a basic Russian national interest mission right now, which is being disruptive to the United States. So Putin and President Biden talked about this at the Geneva summit, fascinating summit. I was there covering it for the Times because all of these summits for the past 70 years have always had the background of nuclear weapons behind them. And this was the first one in which cyber weapons rose up to be of equal importance. And the president said, look, this is a national security issue for us. You've got to get your arms around it. So he gets back to Washington, and 2 weeks later comes this very big, sophisticated attack, as you mentioned, in which R.Evil got into a software company, got into their code, which then spread it to hundreds, if not thousands, of companies around the globe, including many in the United States. So President Biden called Putin last week and said, look, one of two things has got to happen. Either you've got to get this under control or I'm going to do it for you. Interesting threat if he can make it actually work. And then what happened was that R.Evil just disappeared from the web on Tuesday. And we were all trying to figure out, was this US action? Was it instead some kind of Russian action to preempt this? If I had to guess right now, based on just the little clues we've seen, more likely that the Russians took them down, even if just temporarily, and suggested to them they take the summer at the beach. You know, they have nice beaches near the Black Sea, and then reconvene under a different name, maybe come the fall. And that's been the pattern many times before.
And what leverage do we have over Putin, or especially over the non-governmental hackers and ransomware people like R.Evil? I mean, what what can we actually do to retaliate?
Well, part of the argument to Putin is you say you're such a powerful guy who runs the entire country, so then don't turn around and tell us we've all got criminal groups on our territory, we can't stop them. But in fact, it's the same kind of issue we have when there's a terrorist group in Pakistan or Afghanistan or a drug cartel in Mexico, which is to say, you're not going to bomb the whole country for the activity of a criminal group. But in the Mexico example, we do send the Drug Enforcement Agency in sometimes to work with the Mexicans to rout out these groups. The problem here is it's hard to imagine working with the Russians on this. What leverage do we have? Well, we can certainly go try to disable their presence on the web, go after their servers, but you are going into the computer networks in a sovereign country. They could well pop their network back up in another country, maybe one allied to us. We've seen the Russians launch attacks from Amazon servers and GoDaddy servers in the United States. So your options there are a little bit limited. You could, as you suggested before, go after the oligarchs and freeze their money in their accounts. But someone from the Fed is likely to come around and say, we're not sure we want to set the precedent of going in and freezing accounts because someone's going to come in and try to do that to us someday. So, as with most things in life, you have to sort of think about what would feel good and feels like justice and then say, but then what?
David, what is the biggest threat in terms of cyber warfare or cyber ransom? Is it national security or is it economic disruption?
The two intersect when you get to critical infrastructure, right? So some of the attacks we've seen have just been on businesses, but some of them have gone after the things that make the economy and the United States run. So it was only 2.5 months ago that we saw the attack on Colonial Pipeline, a company most people had never heard of, but it turns out they run 45% of all the gasoline, jet fuel, and diesel up and down the East Coast. And you saw what happened, Sam. We suddenly got, in a time of plentiful gas, we suddenly got gas lines and so forth because Colonial Pipeline shut the pipeline down for fear that the code would infect the operating system. We've seen that happen with water distribution. We've seen attacks on gas distribution. We've seen attempts at nuclear power plants. So at that moment, the space between the economic disruption and the national security disruption goes down to about zero.
We don't have to worry too much about foreign interference since we have our own New York City Board of Elections doing the job by itself.
Yes.
How come we didn't have or not aware of any interference in the 2020 election from outside governments?
It's a great question, and there certainly were some attempts, and the after-action report showed modest Russian activity, and interestingly, some new activity from Iran. But by and large, in 2016, we weren't paying attention to what the effects could be. And in 2020, we basically put all of our resources into looking for potential attacks on voting machines, on the registration systems, across influence operations on Facebook. There were some efforts and so forth. But what we saw the Russians do instead was focus on a very different kind of attack, one that focused on a company called SolarWinds that makes the network management software used by most Fortune 500 companies, including the New York Times. They got into the update system of that and then picked about 150 companies and federal agencies to use that to get inside their systems, mostly for spying. But what worries you, Sam, is not just the surveillance, the spying. Lots of countries do that. We do that to other countries. What worries people is what happens once you're inside that system if you could go shut it down or alter data. And the same technology that gets you in to steal documents would also allow you to manipulate data or shut a system down.
something you raise in your book that I think people should read and be aware of, but how does this affect you personally? How has it changed your life? Do you keep wads of cash at home? Do you cover the camera on your computer? How nervous should all of us be?
I don't keep wads of cash at home, but that's because I don't have wads of cash to keep.
Good reason.
That's not a cybersecurity problem. Look, the way you have to think about this, Sam, is the same way you think about how you protect your house against sort of random street crime and break-ins, right? You live in New York City. We expect you to have a lock on your door and, you know, an alarm system that would go off and hopefully scare away, you know, 85% of street crime. But if the North Koreans decide they're going to come in and attack New York with a nuclear weapon, you're not actually expecting that your locks and alarm system are going to do a whole lot of good. And for that, for the highest level of this, you're expecting the government of the United States to provide your protection. Either the police, if it's an organized crime thing, or the military, if it's a foreign state. And I think the same analogy sort of pretty well applies to cyber. You know,
So in other words, keep our fingers crossed, I guess.
Well, you know, you can solve, you know, yeah, don't answer scam emails, you know, telling you that you just won $1 million, Sam, because you probably haven't.
Right.
Be careful of those things that would have you enter a password, but that's all like the usual stuff, and that will protect you from 85, 90% of the problem.
Good advice. Thanks to David Sanger of the New York Times for joining us. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.